Okay, so this is going to be our third lecture on the Roman Empire. And for this one, we're just going to talk about the early empire. So you should have already watched the first lecture, which was about the art of the Republic of Rome before it became an empire. And you should have then watched the lecture on the four styles of Roman or Pompeian painting, which is what we talked about last time. And sorry, I'm skipping through my slides to get to what we're going to talk about today. So today we're going to talk about the early empire, and it's probably not going to be quite as long of a lecture. I'm going to break them up a little bit. So we'll have the early empire, and then we'll do the high empire, and that one's a little longer, I think. Let me look through my notes over here. And then we have the late empire. So we're getting close to getting through all of the Roman Empire. It's kind of a big chunk of Western art history, so we have a lot of time we spend on it. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the history of the early empire. I did the kind of crash course at the beginning, but let me lay in a few specifics so you kind of know what's going on. Julius Caesar, of salad fame. We know who Julius Caesar is. A million years ago when I was in high school in Missouri, you read Shakespeare's play about Julius Caesar your junior year of high school. I've been informed by my students that that is not necessarily the case anymore. So some of you may know about Julius Caesar from having read that play. Some of you might know about him from history. Pretty famous guy, right? So he was one of the consul. Remember we talked about the government structure. So you had your Senate, which is a council of elders, Senate and senior, having the same root word, right? And then you had your consul, your two consuls, which is sort of like a president, but not as powerful. And then in times of crisis, the Senate could make one of the consul a temporary dictator, basically, so that they could operate really efficiently and get the military where it needed to go and things like this. So Julius Caesar becomes kind of a temporary dictator, but then he decides that he wants to stay in power. He wants to maintain that power and become an emperor, basically, and restructure the Roman government so that it's an empire rather than a republic. It's not a very popular idea. People don't like this. So on the Ides of March in 44 BC, he's stabbed to death. He's stabbed in the back. And this is where we get this famous line, Et tu, Brute, where he is saying to his best friend, and you, Brutus, you also stabbed me in the back. And that's also where we get that turn of phrase. Being stabbed in the back is a colloquial phrase that we use for being betrayed, right? Particularly betrayed by someone who's our friend or someone we trusted. That comes from Caesar, so that's where we get that. So this happens, and it causes some chaos, as you can imagine. There's a civil war. So in 31 BC, so Caesar's killed in 44 BC. In 31 BC, Octavian, who is Caesar's nephew, but he's also Caesar's adopted son. So this is kind of, it's not super common, but it's not that unusual of a practice with the Romans. So if you had someone you wanted to be your heir, you wanted to succeed you, who wasn't your biological son necessarily, you could adopt them even if they were an adult. Okay, so it's a little bit funny, but it's something that kind of makes sense when you think about it in a political way. So Caesar wanted Augustus to succeed him, so he adopted him as his son, even though he was his nephew. Okay, so he's related to Caesar, right, and thinks of Caesar as like his dad. He thinks of that as like a direct connection. So there's a civil war. So Mark Antony is kind of on the other side of it, and he doesn't really think there should be dictators, and he kind of wants everything to go back how it was in the Republic. And he is allied with Cleopatra, who is the queen down in Egypt. Mark Antony and Cleopatra are together. They're married. They have a child. And so Octavian is amassing this great force. He's this great military strategist. And Mark Antony is like, hey, Cleopatra, can you send me your navy and some troops and stuff and help me fight this guy? And Octavian crushes them. He crushes Mark Antony and Cleopatra so badly that Cleopatra decides to take her own life, because she thought she would be executed. So she quite famously kills herself by taking a poisonous snake, an asp, and having it bite her, and that's how she dies. Anyway, okay. So he destroys her navy at Actium, and that's kind of the final battle in this big civil war. So the Senate decides that the thing to do is to fall in line with Octavian, and so they confer the title Augustus on him. And Augustus translates to, it kind of means like exalted one, majestic one. It's kind of even beyond like emperor. It's like saying one who should be honored and worshipped, kind of is what the word means, basically. So he then becomes Octavian Augustus. So he's the emperor now. So now we don't have a republic, we have an empire. And part of what settles this is when he becomes Octavian Augustus, he decides that he alone will fill a bunch of different roles that had typically been dispersed among multiple people. So there's the consul, right? And then there's something similar to that called the princeps. That's the first citizen. It's sort of like a president. It's like a lot of the diplomatic and civil kind of duties. And then there's the imperator, which is it's Imperator, and that's the commander-in-chief of the military, okay? And then, and it's the root word of emperor, right? They're kind of similar words. And then after 12 BC, he also becomes the Pontifex Maximus, which is the chief priest, sort of like the Pope, but of course we're pre-Christianity, so like the head of the religion, the religious head of state as well. So Octavian Augustus decides that these powers are not going to be split up between different people. He is going to take on all of these roles, and so he becomes a true emperor, and he takes on all of these different positions. So he basically has control of all of public life. Ostensibly, there's still a Senate, there's still a constitution, but they have much less power. Okay, so he's really centralized all the power in one person on himself. So, generally speaking, as Americans, we tend to not be fans of the idea of an emperor. But one of the sort of side effects of having an emperor, and I'm not saying yay emperors, no, that's not my jam, but one of the things historically that we see, and that is also true in this instance, is that when you have an emperor, when you have all that power kind of stabilized, manifested in one person, it gives them the ability to act quickly, which sometimes leads to collapse and leads to disaster and everything going wrong, and often leads to very bad oppression of people and their rights. But the thing that happens with Octavian Augustus is that he stabilizes the region. The Mediterranean is very stabilized. And we have what is known as Pax Augusta, which means Augustan peace, okay? It's then later called Pax Roma, which is the peace brought on by the Romans. It's confusing, this word peace, because as we know, the way that this peace is held is that they have a very fearful, huge military force, okay? So peace, but, it's because nobody wants him to come in and wipe them out. They saw what happened to Cleopatra. They're not excited about that. This Pax Augusta or Pax Roma prevails for 2 centuries, so 200 years. We have this Pax Romana, this peace in this whole region of the Mediterranean, okay? And in times of peace, this is very significant to us as art historians because there's more art, there's more buildings, there's more infrastructure like roads, bridges, theaters, bathhouses, all this kind of temples, all this kind of thing. And the reason for that is when you aren't having to constantly defend yourself from being attacked all the time, you have time to make things, to make big structures and artworks. You also have money because you're not spending all this money on war. So you have this influx of money that can be spent on civil things like art and buildings and infrastructure and things like that. We also see a lot of commissioned artwork from Augustus himself, from Octavian Augustus. We have imperial sculptures engraved with the deeds of the leaders, not just Augustus, but the other people who worked for him, his generals and people, to put kind of all over the empire. Because remember, this is a big empire, because he wants everyone to know that the peace and the prosperity came from him. So he wants his image everywhere, so everybody's like, oh, the reason that I'm not being killed by the Persians every second is because Octavian Augustus is taking care of me. Or, oh, the reason I can afford all these nice things and my business is doing well in the Mediterranean is because of my leader, Octavian Augustus. So it's this weird kind of propaganda, right? The portraits are designed to sway the public opinion rather than record historical facts. So they're not really documenting things so much as they're kind of establishing, you know, this good stuff is happening because of me. Kind of like, remember King Ramses II when we were talking about Egypt? Who was that really, he was the last warrior king, but he reigned for a long time. He lived to be in his 70s, and he had all those huge, larger-than-life portraits, statues of himself all over the place to remind people that the reason they were doing well and were stable was because of him. So same kind of idea. So Octavian Augustus does all this conquering and peacemaking and whatnot when he's only 31 years old. So we have this rule of elders in the Republic, the Senate. They're old, and we have a style of work from that called verism, which we talked about, which is showing like your wrinkles and your receding hairline and how wise you are and that you've lived a long time, because that's considered good. The idea of ancestors and elders is very positive. So that had been the style that was popular. That comes to a halt because now we've got this young guy who's kicking everyone's ass, who's in charge, Octavian Augustus. And so now the style in sculpture and portraiture is much more akin to ideas that we see all the way back to the early Egyptians, and looking kind of perfect and young forever and kind of godlike. Okay, so we have a youthful head of state, so that becomes the way that he is portrayed and the way other people want to be portrayed as well. Also, Augustus gets the Senate to declare Caesar a god after his death. This is called apotheosis. So this is where a formerly mortal person is raised up to godlike status in the afterlife. Octavian Augustus declared himself the son of a god by doing this, because remember, Caesar was his adopted dad, so he has this kind of connection directly to this deity. And so that also reinforces this idea of portraiture showing him as this kind of godlike leader. The portraits of him also do not age, okay? So he is portrayed as looking like this all throughout his reign. And this is a fairly typical portrait of him, so let's look at this in some depth. So we have him portrayed as a general. He's wearing his cuirass, C-U-I-R-A-S-S, and that is a kind of armor. It's like this leather chest plate that is fitted to the human form. So he has his outfit on, his armor, like he's going into battle, but he wants to show all these different aspects of himself. So he has on his armor, but he's not holding a sword or a bow and arrow or a shield or something like this. Instead, he's wearing his clothing for war, but on the clothing for war, we see a depiction of a diplomatic victory, okay? So what's being depicted here is the return of the Roman banners that the Parthians took from a general. So he went and was able to get these Roman banners back from these people who had stolen them from Rome. And so he's depicting this diplomatic thing that he was able to do on his armor. So it's kind of showing strength in military, strength in diplomacy. This idea is also reinforced by the stance. He has his hand raised. That's the stance of an orator, someone who would speak in public, which is kind of fitting for a head of state or a diplomat. So he wants to show these different aspects of himself and his personality. The other thing you might notice is, who is this little figure down by his foot reaching up towards him? Well, you can't quite tell in this picture, but that baby has wings. So this is Cupid or Eros. And that seems kind of odd. Why do we have this godchild in this portrait of Octavian Augustus? Well, one of the things that was somewhat common with the Greeks, and definitely we saw with the Egyptians as well, was this idea of tying mortal leaders to gods, okay? And so Octavian Augustus, through his bloodline of Julius Caesar and Julius Caesar's bloodline, traces their heritage all the way back to Aeneas. Aeneas is a hero of the Iliad, of the Trojan War, and he supposedly is Venus's son. Okay, so, well, in the Greek mythology, Aphrodite's son, but since they're Roman, Venus's son. So they trace their lineage back to this goddess, right? And so Cupid, as you may recall, is her son as well. So having Cupid in his portrait is showing this lineage. He has this divine lineage, okay, and reinforcing the idea that I'm not just a man who's your leader and great warrior and all of these things. I'm also in part a god, okay? So that's kind of what a lot of the symbolism here is showing all these aspects of his role that he's created for himself, and also showing this kind of divine lineage. He is married several times. His first wife is Clodia Pulchra, and they divorced. She was Mark Antony's stepdaughter, so he initially married her to kind of show a peace, sort of get both people who were on both sides of the Civil War on his side. They get divorced. Then he marries Scribonia, and they have a child named Julia the Elder, who becomes important. She's an empress later. And then he marries Livia Drusilla, who is his third wife, but kind of his, I don't want to say most important because we're talking about people, but she was his most influential wife, let's say. So she was very influential as the empress. She was also his confidant. She also gave him lots of advice. She was very educated. And she lives to be 86 years old. So she is kind of an important figure in the Roman Empire for a long time. Her son, Tiberius, becomes the emperor after Octavian Augustus because Octavian adopts him. So he adopts her son from a previous marriage to be his own son and his heir, which I think is kind of nice. This idea of adopting your stepson to be your heir there's something very civil about that. I kind of like that. Then they have a son named Claudius Drusus. Oh no, that's her other son that he also adopts. Okay, so those are the children. They don't have children together, but he adopts her two sons. And then they have grandsons, Claudius, Caligula, and Nero, who all also become emperors. So their blood, what I'm saying is their bloodline continues on and is quite important in the history of the empire. And also his stepson, who he adopts, Tiberius, who becomes the emperor, this is kind of weird, marries Julia the Elder, which is Augustus's biological daughter from his first marriage. So that's or his second marriage. So that's a little strange, but anyway. Okay, back to this. So that was just a little rundown of more of the history. So this is Ara Pacis Augustae. So this is the altar of Augustan peace. So I told you that this idea of Augustan peace lasting for 200 years, where it then becomes the Roman peace, right, is really significant historically and very significant in terms of the art and architecture that's made. And so this is kind of an interesting thing. So we saw the altar of Zeus when we were looking at the ancient Greeks, which was sort of a similar structure to this. So it's somewhere between a sculpture and a building. It's kind of a monument. I likened the altar of Zeus to kind of the Lincoln Memorial in DC. So you can walk around it, you can go up in it and everything, but it's not exactly a building. This is the same kind of structure. And generally these are made much like triumphal arches to commemorate a specific event, usually a battle. Usually these kind of things are made to commemorate battles. So this one is pretty unique and interesting because it's to commemorate a time of peace that's achieved by Emperor Octavian Augustus. So it's kind of an interesting thing. So we have this, and one of the reasons we have this that's kind of interesting is Octavian Augustus writes sort of his memoirs, and he calls this Resgeste Divi Augusti, which translated to English is achievements of the deified Augustus. So no self-esteem issues here. He writes about himself as if he is a god, and he writes about his life and finishes this shortly before he dies. Dies when he's 76, so he lives a very long life, and he writes this thing. And in his own words, in his book, he says that the peace he achieved was his greatest achievement, and that's the thing that he's most proud of. So it makes sense that this kind of monument was made. So on the west facade, we're celebrating what he considered his most important achievement, which is bringing peace to Rome. The Senate dedicated this on Livia's birthday, on his third wife's birthday, so it was kind of seen as this almost like present to her, in a way, like commemorating how well her husband has done. Another thing, I mentioned that Augustus is portrayed as youthful forever. Livia is as well, but her hairstyle changes with the fashion each time she's portrayed. So her hairstyle changes to stay in style, but her face always remains young, even though she lives to be 86. Excuse me, I have a tickle in my throat. Okay, so on the east and west facades, we are of this monument feature mythological scenes. One that we are not seeing is features Aeneas making a sacrifice. So Aeneas is this famous warrior in the Trojan War, and he was the son of Venus. He's kind of Rome's first big hero, and Virgil writes the Aeneid about him. By having that as the subject of one of the facades of this altar, Augustus is highlighting his connection to Aeneas, as he was supposedly the founder of the Julian line. So again, he's like Julius Caesar's great-great-great-great-grandfather, basically, and Caesar was Augustus's adopted dad, so he's trying to solidify that connection. The second panel is of Tellus. That's this panel in the upper right here. So Tellus, Tellus, is Mother Earth, or Gaia, Gaia. It's likely her. This is one that a lot of scholars kind of argue about. Some people think it's Ceres, who's the goddess of grain, or Pax, which is just a personification of peace, or there's some people who argue that this is actually Venus. I like the idea that it's Tellus, the Mother Earth goddess, because I think that makes the most sense in the context of what's happening. So one of the things that happens during a time of peace, during Pax Augusta, is that everything is bountiful, right? Everything does well. The agriculture does well. People get more prosperous. We have more art. We have more building. So if this is Gaia, our Mother Earth goddess, we have these kind of flowers behind her. We have bushels of wheat. We have an ox at the bottom of her feet. So this is kind of a domesticated sort of cattle-like thing. What is the word? Livestock being impressive at the time. And then we have the personifications of these breezes. So on the left, we have the personification of the sky breeze, which is this woman sitting on a bird. Then on the right, we have this woman who's sitting on this sea creature, sea serpent kind of thing. So that's the personification of the water. So we have the bounty of the earth with the livestock and the grain and things. We have the sky and we have the water. So to me, it makes sense if this is depicting all of these aspects, sky, sea, and earth, all in harmony. It makes sense if this is Gaia. But the main idea is that this is what the Pax Augustus, the peace of Augustus, brings to the Roman Empire, is this nice, serene harmony, okay? There's another panel that features the procession of the imperial family. The children look and act like children. They don't just look like miniature adults. So this is getting a little more into realism. You can see this panel in the lower left here. And this becomes kind of this golden age in the Roman Empire is under Octavian Augustus. So we have marriage, children, peace, art, prosperity, that kind of thing. Okay, let's look at the Forum of Augustus. So he completes work to finish Julius Caesar's Forum, and then he begins construction of his own Forum right next to it. It's white marble from Carrara, not fake. This isn't that trick where they mixed marble dust into plaster or stucco and surfaced it. This is actual real marble moved in from Carrara. So very, very expensive, very fancy. And new quarries had just been discovered at this time. So Octavian Augustus's boast is that when he found Rome, it was a city of brick, and he made it a city of marble. So this is one of the things he says in his book, and that he's famous for saying, is that he rose it up into this really prosperous thing. He included marble portraits of all the Julians, going back to Aeneas, so Julius Caesar all the way back to Aeneas. He copied the idea of the caryatids in the Erechtheion at Athens. So when we look at the Acropolis, the caryatids, remember, were those columns where instead of the column there was a figure standing there, a sculpture. So we see that. There's also this, so you can see on this little map that it shows where all these important figures were created. We also in the forum, he pays tribute to Venus, Mars, and Julius Caesar, who, remember, he made a god, so he also is kind of put in this temple in the forum. There's also the chariot of Augustus we have in the center there. Okay, let's look at a couple more things. So we have the forum is today in ruins, which you can see up above there, but I have a reconstruction that you can look at below. Okay. Many of the same people who worked on this structure worked on this other structure, which is the Maison Carrée, which again, if you've taken French, means square house, right? Carré is square. So this is the square house, which is in Nimes, France. Remember, the Roman Empire now is all over the Mediterranean. So it's also in France. This was built in southern France in Roman times. The Romans defeated the Gauls. The Gauls were the people who lived here before. This is the best surviving example of Augustinian architecture, or this classical architecture from the early empire. And this is one of the earlier projects of Octavian Augustus. And one of the projects before that was one of his aqueducts. So we'll talk about the aqueduct in a minute, but I want to look at this really quick. So we see the same kind of thing as in the Republican Roman era, where we have kind of the floor plan and layout of an Etruscan temple, but we have the pediment and columns like a Greek temple, but it doesn't follow any of the Greeks' ideas about how architecture should be. They would have hated it. We also have Corinthian columns here, which is a throwback to the Hellenistic, the late period of ancient Greece. Okay, this is Pont de Garde, also in Nimes, France, so close to the Maison Carrée. So this is super impressive. So this is the Great Aqueduct Bridge. An aqueduct is a structure that carries water from one place to the other. So I talked a lot about how the Romans had really great roads, and they had sewers and things like this. They also had these pretty fantastic structures of aqueducts that are still standing today, which I find unbelievably mind-blowing. I think it's kind of amazing. So this is known today as the Pont de Garde. This is the name of the river, so it's a bridge over this river, the Garde River. An aqueduct carries water from mountains to the Tiber River, in Roman's case. 100 gallons a day were brought to Nimes from the source 30 miles away. Very large arches support this. These things are 82 feet wide, so these are huge arches. It's made with concrete. That's how it's able to be structured this way. So it's kind of beautiful and just a really impressive kind of rad structure. The Porta Maggiore in Rome, Italy from 50 CE. So this was actually built by Claudius. Porta, it means gate, so it's a gate. The upper layers concealed aqueducts, so I like to show this after it. And you can kind of see, if you look at that cross section, they've blocked off the aqueducts are no longer functioning. But you can see up there where the aqueducts ran through this, but at this point they're kind of hidden. They're part of the architecture, which is really fascinating. It has what's called rusticated masonry, which is to contrast this Augustan and Greek idea of everything being very smooth and marble and beautiful. Claudius liked this idea of things being having more of a texture. It's dressed masonry, so it's carved to look like columns, even though it isn't technically standalone columns. Okay, we'll look at the Domus Aria. This is Nero's golden house in Rome. So remember, he's a grandson of Octavian Augustus. So this is Nero's golden house. We have a lot of fourth style painting in here, which, as you recall from the previous lecture, means that we have both the fake windows where you're looking out into architectural scenes that are kind of fantastical and don't make sense, and also the patches where we have figures and stories from mythology and things like this. In 64 CE, Nero succeeds Claudius. He's Claudius's stepson. This is after Rome burned. Nero creates a new building code with more fireproofing, so that's pretty important. And he hires Severus and Lealer to be the engineers and architects to create this new vision he has for Rome. They're quite brilliant. They further explore concrete and make further developments and really fantastic advancements. So Nero decides to build this luxurious new home for himself. The entrance had a humongous sculpture of Nero as Sol, as the sun god. There was marble paneling throughout the house. There was gilded stucco, which is why it's called the gold house. The Domus Aria means gold house. There was a dome in the foyer that had an oculus, or a round window up at the top. This is the earliest use of groin vaults in a domestic setting that we see. And they were designed in such a way, and I'm going to jump over to this. So they were designed in such a way that they allowed the house to be lit with these really fantastic skylights that were possible because of the groin vaults. There's so many typos in my stupid slide here. I'm sorry. It's Severus and Lealer, basically. So that's silly. So we see these groin vaults, and they allow them to have fenestration, to have windows, right, that are angled in such a way so as to light the whole golden room below. And this is kind of the first time the house is not limited by vaults, but actually shaped by them. So the shape of it is sort of dictated by the presence of these groin vaults that hold it up. It's really architecturally fascinating. Okay, so we'll talk about the Flavians now. So we come to the end of the Julians with Nero, and then we have the Flavians. Nero dies by suicide in 68. He was pretty sure he was about to be assassinated, so he decided to do it himself. And this is the end of the Julian line of emperors. So there's a year of conflict deciding who is going to rule. Basically, the person who's the victor is Vespasian. Vespasian had been a general under both Claudius and Nero, and he was very well respected and well regarded as a leader in the military, so people thought he would be a good leader overall. His family name is Flavius, so that's where we get the Flavian line that starts with him, so it's Vespasian Flavius, pardon me. His sons are Titus and Domitian, who both rule after he dies, and so we have this Flavian dynasty. So his big claim to fame is that the Colosseum is built during the reign of the Flavians. So this seats, remember the Pompeii amphitheater seated 20,000 people, which seems crazy. This seated 56,000 spectators. It was built on the grounds of Nero's artificial lake that he made for his very ostentatious house. Vespasian reclaimed that for the public. So basically, he puts this here as a statement, as a gift to the people of Rome, saying, I'm not going to use all your money for my own private house or anything like that. I'm going to use it to build things for you, the people. Here's a gigantic Colosseum for you to be entertained in, and I'm building it directly on top of part of Nero's private residence because I value you. So it was really a statement. The name is from its placement. It was by the Colossus of Nero. So this was a 120-foot sculpture called the Colossus. So that's why this is called the Colosseum. The sculpture no longer exists. It is not finished during Vespasian's reign, but Titus finishes it in 80 CE. And it could not have been built without concrete. That would have been impossible. So the whole structure is based on the engineering potential of the arch and of barrel vaults and also of concrete. It's a very complex system of barrel vaulted corridors that hold it up. Today it's just the concrete skeleton because during the fall of Rome, the marble seats and surfaces were all stripped off by people who used them for other things. It's the height of a 16-story building, and when it was completed, everything was faced in marble. So just think about what that would have looked like. Okay, Flavian portraiture. Here's a portrait of Vespasian. So this is carved out of marble. And so we see that he wants to be portrayed not as a god, not as a handsome young person who's eternally youthful and whatever, like the Julians were into. He wants to be unpretentious. He was an army general. He wanted to distance himself from all the opulence of Nero's rule, which was seen as bad. People were very unhappy with him. They thought he squandered all the wealth and just spent things on silly things for himself. So we see a return of Verism, which, remember, we looked at Verism when we were talking about the Roman Republic. So Verism comes back where we're showing wrinkles, we're showing, Vespasian is bald. And so we have this break with this Augustan tradition of godlike emperors. Okay, this is a portrait bust of a Flavian woman. I love this sculpture. I include it because it's one of many. There's lots of these. This is a common sculpture. But she's quite beautiful and young. She's not an idealized version of this veristic Republican kind of idea. She is a youthful woman, but portrayed fairly realistically. So her hair, this was the style during the Flavian time, which I think is hysterical. So they would make all these curls and pile them up in the front, and then they had quite long hair that would be braided, set in braids, and then wrapped up in this big bun in the back. And I just think it's kind of rad and also kind of funny. So this was sort of a sign of this changing style. The other thing that's cool about it is we have, the curls are made out of a new kind of technological sort of breakthrough. So up until this point, a chisel, just like tapping a chisel with a hammer, was used for carving marble. This kind of hairstyle leads to the advent of a new tool that is a kind of corkscrew drill. So it's a hand cranked corkscrew drill. So this new carving technology is created so that this hairstyle can be portrayed more easily. And this becomes, it sticks around because it's used for beards and things like this in the future, but it really is created for this particular hairstyle, which is kind of funny. This is the Arch of Titus. This is a triumphal arch. So it's a freestanding arch that commemorates a person or a battle or something. It's kind of like the altar of peace that we saw before, but a different kind of structure. These stick around for a while. This is a very popular kind of thing. We have composite capitals, which combines the Ionic and the Corinthian orders. So this is a different kind of column capital than we've seen before. In this, we see Titus's apotheosis, which means he, like Augustus, is ascended to heaven as a god. That's what apotheosis means. So that is shown here. It's very bad, so that's a good thing. What's bad is when you have what's called damnatio memoriae, which is something the Senate can proclaim. So like Nero was so unpopular and was such a disgrace that he has this status designated, and that basically means the Senate damns you and all your statues and likenesses get destroyed. So it's literally destroying the memory of you. So that's the bad thing. The good thing for an emperor is for you to have a nice arch that's commemorating you. Another interesting thing is we have this I think this is interesting because you see that's a menorah, so that's kind of like, that's an interesting thing to see in there, that kind of menorah-like candelabra thing. It's not like, so this is showing the kind of things brought back from the East during a successful conquest. So it's just interesting to see these kind of like different details in the things that are being brought back from essentially pillages on conquests in the East. Okay, so next time we will talk about the High Empire. That was all the early empire with the Julians and the Flavians. All right.